Moscow, 1961. Two men are led to their execution. Their crime? Exchanging money, not murder, not treason, not espionage, money exchange. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. When they were first tried and convicted, their crime didn't carry the death penalty. The maximum sentence was 15 years in prison. The Soviet government changed the law retroactively, specifically to execute them. This is the story of Yan Rokotov and Vladislav Faibishenko, two men who built a black market empire in the heart of the Soviet Union. Two men who became so successful that Nikita Khrushchev himself demanded their deaths. And this is the story of how personal rage, political pressure, and Soviet paranoia created one of the most controversial death sentences in Cold War history. Welcome to Soviet Case Files. To understand why two people were executed for currency exchange, you need to understand the Soviet economy of the 1950s. In the USSR, foreign currency was completely illegal for ordinary citizens. You couldn't own dollars. You couldn't own British pounds. You couldn't own German marks. Possession of foreign currency was considered economic sabotage against the state. The official exchange rate was absurd. $1 equaled 4 Soviet rubles. But on the street, the real value was closer to 15 or 20 rubles per dollar. The Soviet government maintained this fiction because it allowed them to control everything: foreign travel, international trade, even what Soviet citizens could buy. But here's the problem. Foreign currency was still necessary. Diplomats needed it. Foreign tourists had it. Soviet officials traveling abroad required it. And increasingly, ordinary Soviet citizens wanted it because it could buy things rubles couldn't. Western goods, luxury items, access. This created a massive black market. And where there's demand, there are entrepreneurs. Enter Yan Rokotov. Born in 1931, Rokotov grew up in Moscow during Stalin's terror. He was Jewish, which meant he faced discrimination at every turn. He was smart, charismatic, and ambitious. But the Soviet system offered him no legitimate path to success, so he created his own. By his early 20s, Rokotov had figured out the game. He started small, exchanging currency for foreign students and tourists. He was charming, spoke multiple languages, and had an instinct for who to trust. His partner, Vladislav Faibishenko, was the opposite: quiet, methodical, cautious. Where Rokotov was the face of the operation, Faibishenko was the brain. He kept the books, managed the network, calculated the risks. Together, they were unstoppable. By the late 1950s, they had built an empire. Their operation was sophisticated. They had agents in every major hotel in Moscow: the Metropole, the National, the Ukraine. These agents would approach foreign guests, offer better exchange rates than the official banks, and facilitate transactions. Rokotov and Faibishenko didn't just exchange currency, they laundered it. They moved it across borders through diplomatic channels. They had connections in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in tourist, even in the KGB. The money was staggering. Conservative estimates put their operation at over 10 million rubles in illegal transactions. In today's terms, that's tens of millions of dollars. Rokotov lived like a king. He had a luxury apartment in central Moscow, tailored Italian suits. He ate at the best restaurants, dated beautiful women, drove expensive cars. In a society built on equality, he was flaunting inequality. And in the Soviet Union, that kind of visibility was dangerous. The KGB had known about Rokotov for years, but his operation was so large, so well connected that they needed time. Time to gather evidence. Time to identify every player in the network. Time to build an airtight case. In 1959, they launched Operation Valuta, currency. KGB agents went undercover. They posed as foreign tourists. They infiltrated Rokotov's network, gaining the trust of his agents. They recorded conversations. They photographed transactions. They followed the money. For months, the KGB watched. They documented everything, every exchange, every contact, every ruble. They were building a case that would be impossible to fight. May 1960, the trap snapped shut. Rokotov was arrested at his apartment. Faibishenko was picked up the same day. Within 48 hours, the KGB had rounded up over 30 members of their network. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, witness testimony, recorded conversations. The KGB had documented years of illegal activity. The trial began in December 1960. Soviet trials were not like Western trials. There was no presumption of innocence. The accused were guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence was nearly impossible. Rokotov and Faibishenko were charged with speculation in foreign currency on an especially large scale. Under Soviet law at the time, the maximum penalty was 15 years in a labor camp. The prosecution painted them as parasites, enemies of the people, capitalist vultures feeding on Soviet society. The defense argued that currency exchange was a victimless crime, that the defendants were simply meeting market demand, that the real problem was the Soviet government's unrealistic exchange rates. The court was not sympathetic. In January 1961, the verdict came down, guilty on all counts. Yan Rokotov, 15 years in a labor camp. Vladislav Faibishenko, 15 years in a labor camp. By Soviet standards, it was a harsh sentence, but it was not a death sentence. The case should have ended there. Two criminals convicted, justice served, case closed, but the case landed on the desk of Nikita Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was furious. Nikita Khrushchev saw the Rokotov case as a symbol of everything wrong with Soviet society: corruption, Western influence, greed, the decay of socialist values. He believed that currency speculators were undermining the Soviet economy, that they were agents of capitalism, poisoning Soviet youth with Western decadence. But more than that, Khrushchev was personally offended. In 1956, he had denounced Stalin's crimes. He had promised a new era of Soviet justice. He had positioned himself as a reformer, someone who would restore the rule of law. And now these two criminals were getting only 15 years for what he saw as economic treason. 15 years felt like a mockery, so Khrushchev made a decision that would shock the world. He ordered the law changed. May 1961, the Supreme Soviet passed a new decree. Currency speculation would now be punishable by death. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The law was applied retroactively. Rokotov and Faibishenko had already been tried. They had already been convicted. They were already serving their sentences in labor camps. But the Soviet government decided to retry them under the new law. This violated a fundamental principle of justice. You cannot be punished for something that wasn't a crime when you did it. It's called ex post facto law, and it's prohibited in virtually every legal system in the world. But the Soviet Union didn't care. June 1961, Rokotov and Faibishenko were brought back to Moscow for a new trial. This time, the charges were the same. The evidence was the same. The only difference was the penalty. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution argued that currency speculation was a grave threat to the Soviet state, that it enriched criminals while impoverishing honest workers, that it spread Western corruption. The defense argued that retroactive punishment was unjust, that changing the law after the fact violated basic legal principles, that this was a return to Stalinist terror. The court sided with the prosecution, July 14, 1961. The verdict, death by firing a squad. The defense immediately filed an appeal. It was denied. They filed a petition for clemency. It was denied. International human rights organizations protested. The Soviet government ignored them. On July 30th, 1961, Yan Rokotov and Vladislav Faibishenko were executed. They were shot in the basement of Lubyanka prison. Their bodies were cremated. Their families were not told where their ashes were buried. 2 men executed for exchanging money. The execution of Rokotov and Faibishenko sent shock waves through the Soviet Union and beyond. In the West, the case became a symbol of Soviet injustice. Newspapers called it a return to Stalinist show trials. Legal scholars condemned the retroactive application of the death penalty. The United Nations Human Rights Commission issued a statement criticizing the Soviet Union for violating international legal standards. But the international outcry didn't matter to Khrushchev. He saw them executions as a necessary message. The Soviet state would not tolerate economic crime. Inside the Soviet Union, the reaction was more complex. Many ordinary citizens supported the executions. They saw Rokotov and Faibishenko as greedy criminals who had gotten rich while others struggled. In a society that preached equality, their wealth was an insult. But among intellectuals, lawyers, and even some party officials, there was deep unease. The retroactive law set a dangerous precedent. If the government could change the law after the fact to execute currency dealers, what would stop them from doing it again? Some Soviet jurists quietly protested. They wrote memos arguing that retroactive punishment violated Soviet legal principles, but their objections were ignored. The Rokotov case became a turning point. It showed that Khrushchev's promises of reform had limits, that the Soviet state would still use terror when it suited its purposes. And here's the bitter irony. The executions didn't stop currency speculation. The black market for foreign currency continued to thrive. New dealers replaced Rokotov and Faibishenko. The demand for dollars didn't disappear just because 2 men were shot. If anything, the executions made currency dealing more profitable. The risk was higher, so the prices went up. By the 1970s and 1980s, currency speculation was more widespread than ever. Soviet citizens routinely exchanged rubles for dollars on the black market. Tourists were approached in every major city. The Soviet government had executed 2 men,